Panels. The most important interest of a parent is that their child lead a happy and fulfilling life. We think that in a relationship-obsessed world, exposing a child from a young age to a countervailing narrative of a preference for being single not only makes that child far happier and more well-developed, but means that the eventual quality of the relationship they get into on either side of the house is likely to be far better. What is our model before explaining this thesis? What we think this likely looks like is attempting as a parent to instill a preference for being single in your child via the books, media, and interactions you share with them. This might look like showing them stories of people who live happily single lives without a relationship, like your uncle who never got married, for example, and exposing them to other adult figures that have these kinds of things. Obviously, this nuance likely scales with the child's age, so we're not going to give complex narratives as to why people are being single from fairly young. We'll probably do this in a fairly nuanced manner in the same way that other developmental things are exposed and other developmental narratives happen over time, in the same way that we talk about sex ed, things like this with children at a later age as it scales with their increasing age. The second thing I want to note is we don't think this looks like the demonization of people in relationships, right? We think it likely looks more like saying this is on balance preferable to be single via the cherry picking of specific contexts of happy people who aren't in relationships, and saying that this is preferable by offering some cautionary tales of bad relationships and things like this. If there's a clarification, I'll take a look at it. Cool. Moving on. In terms of characterizing parents' interests, I think the primary interest of a parent pretty clearly is for their child to lead a happy and fulfilling life and that be safe. These are both immense social and biological pressures for this to be the overriding narrative. I don't think off-bench will contest this and it's not in their interest. What is the framing? This is the single most critical thing I'm going to say in this round. So if no notes panel takes nothing else away from my speech, just take this away. Ahmed can do all the rest of the work in the debate. The pressure to engage in relationships exists symmetrically on either side of the house. That is to say, in either world, it is likely that there are significant pressures for most people to get into a relationship eventually either way. Why? These are immense biological factors. That is to say, intimacy feels good in a way that is distinct from a hookup. That is to say, that being in a relationship with someone and being cuddled and having your head scratched feels qualitatively different than hooking up with someone and engaging in transactional sex. Secondly, social factors. Rom-coms and so on and other media narratives demonstrate relationships as desirable. It's saturated on social media with celebrity couples and stories offering countless stories about different people and their relationships. But thirdly, friend groups exist and associate relationships as something to be important. This means that it is likely in schools you are exposed to this narrative and pieces outside the parents' direct sphere of influence. And note crucially that all these factors scale with age. Most people end up in a relationship because eventually it makes sense to pool your incomes and put a down payment on a home. So when you become far older and you get closer to my age, you start thinking more seriously about what a long-term committed relationship looks like, and the pressure becomes more exponentially important, especially as your biological urge to reproduce becomes stronger. All of these things mean that in either world, there is likely a beginning pressure and an increasing pressure over time for people to get into relationships eventually on either side. The question then in this debate is when they get into relationships, how do they do it, and is the quality of that eventual relationship better? I will also give a ton of reasons why being single is preferable as a child, but let's first talk about why we facilitate better engagement with relationships. Note that per my framing, all of these pressures to get into one exist from outside forces, which means it's probably the case these outside forces have a pretty big influence on your life. The question you're asking now, panel, is why is the parent likely to have a significant influence in order to mitigate and check back against those pressures? Firstly, note that children often respect you very much. If you try to instill this narrative in them from a young age, you're starting from a point of positional asymmetry with them, where your positionality is significantly one of more authority over them, which means you can normalize this narrative to them from a young age so it doesn't seem as crazy to them when they reach the rebellious phase as a teenager. But secondly, you can expose them to other options and influences they might not have considered, and because there is often a degree of trust cultivated in parent-child relationships, it's likely they believe you, or at the very least, question the narrative they're getting from school at the point at which they engage with you in these things. But thirdly, many people, especially women because of the sexist and patriarchal society we live in, find relationships to be very scary, but feel pressure from these outside forces. We give these people who already want not to be in relationships from a young age an escape valve. Once we give them that escape valve, it's likely those people will want to listen to you. Before I go on, closing.
Why do you have to teach people to be single in order to be careful in relationships?
I'm going to give the comparative. You can't why you can't teach the other narrative very, very soon. What does this mean? The thesis of all these subclaims is it creates a higher bar to enter a relationship, right? Note that we don't need to win and say every person waits to get into a relationship until they're 40 in order to win the debate. All we have to win in order to prove this claim is that this narrative instills a questioning about whether or not it is the right time to get into a relationship at every point in your life because it is a narrative you are raised in from a young age. What does this do? The first thing it does is it means you're more likely as a child child at the individual level to opt into relationships more slowly. This means you are likely to pick and choose partners with a greater degree of discriminatory latitude because you no longer feel that it is instrumental to you to be in a relationship, but rather want to derive certain meaning from that relationship. So you feel less pressure to commit early, especially at a young age. But secondly, you have access to a diversity of narratives. We lack epistemic access to the individual child's preferences. It is possible that some children mature faster and more readily than others, and others don't. It is possible that some people are very afraid of relationships, and others are not. Insofar as that is true, exposure to a diversity of narratives gives children the optimal balance of being able to pick and choose from different narratives about relationships that exist in society. So in terms of affording the child maximal agency, we are better on our side. The third thing I want to note is for children who are bad at boundary regulation, it gives them an opt-out of that boundary regulation, so they're able to develop and mature far faster. What is the comparative? Before I explain that opening.
Your delta seems to just be very, very small. That is, you think children will enter relationships anyway, you just want them to think more carefully about
Yes, this is called strategic framing. They think more carefully about it, and therefore they do it better. Even if it is a small delta in some instances, it is very large in other instances for children who don't want to be in relationships. And for children who do want to be in relationships, they think about it more, they mature more, they regulate their boundaries better. What is the comparative? Because opposition is going to say, we'll just tell them to be in a good relationship instead. Why is this a worse narrative to push as a parent? The first thing is this narrative has a higher degree of nuance threshold significantly. That is to say, in order to teach a parent what a good relationship is, a child what a good relationship is, it is very, very difficult to convey because it is complex and often very nuanced. But secondly, you as a parent likely don't always have the clearest conception of what a good relationship is in the first place, so it's far harder to convey at that individual level. But finally, our narrative is far more beneficial for the most vulnerable. That is, people who are very, very scared of entering into relationships, people who are ace, people who want to opt out of that narrative. So we're far better on those individuals. But the final thing is, children have a far harder time at boundary navigation on their side. So you tell them, just be in a good relationship instead. They're not sure what a good relationship is because they don't understand the nuance that you're trying to convey to them. On our side, we get a clear blanket narrative from a young age to protect and mitigate the worst possible harms, while simultaneously allowing, because they still go to school, they still engage outside, the other narrative. So that comparative is why we're better in terms of engagement in relationships. The final impact of all this, I want to say, is for women especially, who feel an immense amount of coercive pressure to get into a relationship, this can often be incredibly liberatory. The end impact of this is that at the point at which people opt into relationships on our side, they do it later, they do it slower, and they do it with a greater degree of boundary regulation. For all those reasons, I think we won the first argument. Why is being single longer awesome? Note that when you're young, inherently relationships are more fleeting. That is to say, encouraging their deprioritization is just good objectively. It gives you more time to explore other things. You make fewer sacrifices. You might go study abroad instead of staying put in that terrible relationship with a dead-end deadbeat from your hometown. Insofar as we afford maximal agency for these children by encouraging them to be single longer and allow them to make better choices in that regard, we also win purely on the qualitative benefits of being single, and I'm incredibly proud to stand in PM.
Alright, I think that speaker and call me LO here.
The problem with government's case is pretty clear. You maybe think a little bit more about getting into a relationship, but once you're there, you've disappointed your parents, and you don't have any of the people to turn to talk to about your relationship, none of the experience or feelings or knowledge of how to navigate that relationship, and none of the according agency that you get in the world of opposition. I'll do two things. First, ref of all their case, actually I'll do frame first, and then an argument about why if you succeed, being single is just not that good, and second, why in the vast majority of cases where you fail, this is quite bad. In terms of frame, our case is that we're not just going to accept the full-on existence of the narratives they say are so harmful. We think that instead, parents should seek to understand their children, talk to them, get to know what they want, what they're comfortable with, and have these conversations so that they can figure out what is best for their child. And notice, this is really consistent with the direction of parenting. We live in a society where lots of relationship structures are available to people. You have a fair degree of choice over what type of relationship you enter and over the type of person you love. Because the parent-child relationship is shifting toward a progressive one that acknowledges children's likes and dislikes. My brother is literally raising a baby right now, and the parenting books that he reads say things like, don't say no to your child because they'll be like very negative as a result, and it'll like lead them to be pessimistic, for example. Is it true that we should prevent children from having sex, for example, at a young age? Probably. But should we tell them that, should we never talk to them about sex as a result? Should we tell them sex is quite evil? Probably not. This doesn't seem to lead to any of the good things they want. In terms of ref, one, their narrative cannot be so soft. If they suggest that there are an overwhelming extent of other societal narratives that force you into a relationship, then in order to get any of their side benefits, they need to support a much stricter one, saying single is actively good and being in a relationship is actively bad. Okay, in terms of their claim on better engagement, the problem is when you enter these relationships, you probably won't talk about it. You won't say as much to your parents. Instead, on our side, the availability of relationships means that you can talk to your parents about it. The fact that you might compare it to the idealized relationship that you think your parents have means that you can ask about it. But I also just think the narrative that they push is just really, really weak, right? Like, this is, it's sort of the inverse way of saying that our narrative is complex and theirs is just highly reductive. But even so, I just don't think our narrative is that complex. You can tell your kid to look for things like, is your boyfriend being manipulative? When you're with your girlfriend, do you feel comfortable expressing yourself? These are basic questions that you can tell them to be thinking about that makes the relationship better. I wish I could weigh their last argument, but it's just like, it's contingent off of like not being in a relationship at some point, and they never tell you how early or when. Like, weighing that is just unclear. Okay. If you succeed, being single is not good. A couple of reasons why we think being single into the long term is just not preferable for people, given that their narrative needs to be a lot stronger than they suggest. One, people derive immense joy from relationships. We're social animals. We cannot get these things out of our sorts of friends. We derive satisfaction from the incredible intimacy, the overwhelming sense of connection that overrides the moment, and that is so fulfilling that you cannot let out of your life. This is immensely valuable. Second, people form emotional connections which provide them support. You feel comfortable turning to people to talk about your emotional problems or your anxieties. And the reality is that most people are not comfortable sharing every single element of themselves with their friends or their family. And this is true at a young age as well. Giving them the opportunity to do so in an environment that feels judgment-free is much, much more powerful and provides you with a sense of emotional connection that is necessary in your youth. 3, it helps you grow better. Relationships prompt you to understand yourself better, and especially in relationships to others. Because you learn what you want and what you don't want. You learn how to cooperate and work with other people. You learn how to manage conflict because relationships are critical to you, and because the stakes are often so high emotionally that you actually care to internalize these things. But fourth of all, in a lot of instances, this feeling of loneliness is just terrifying. It leaves you feeling unfulfilled and leaves you feeling very scared because you don't know who to turn to when things get difficult. The second argument then is why in the vast majority of cases where they fail, this is quite bad for people. I'll take closing.
All 4 reasons that you just cited could be said about a very, very close friend as well. Just check your flow. Shouldn't we be encouraging people to develop more of those relationships?
Yeah, so they can't be said of just friends, which is why I compared them to things like friends, like the things that you don't do with friends. You don't have sex with your friends. You don't have that feeling of intimacy that you get as a result. Like, and it doesn't occur at least within the confines of a relationship where you feel like after the fact you can disclose all these emotions. But second, like you don't care about those friendships to nearly the same extent because it's not inculcated in you to do so. Second, in the vast majority of cases where you fail, this is bad. Children will end up entering relationships as they say. There's curiosity, there's hormones, there's the availability. So you end up getting into relationships at a pretty high frequency, the same way our parents say don't do drugs, but we still end up doing drugs. When you enter into relationships, it is really harmful for a few reasons in their world. 1, you enter them later on their side by a fair margin in some cases because of the shame that you might feel. This is actually quite bad because when you enter into these relationships at later years, it's a lot more difficult and higher stakes because it occurs later in your life. So you don't have the accumulation of experiences in relationships to understand how to navigate these things. You don't feel as comfortable within that relationship or have these sort of sets of other relationships prior to know what you like and what you don't like. And that makes it really difficult to get any of the same fulfillment that you might otherwise get from having gone through multiple partners and seen what life can be with any given one of them. Second, your relationships are distorted because of the narratives of fear that your parents probably have to try to impose on you. Doing things like men are scary or will take advantage of you can make it really, really uncomfortable to emotionally give yourself up to a man in a relationship or to be able to form the same types of intimacy that you can get on our side. So even when they do get relationships, it's not nearly as fulfilling as they would desire. Go ahead.
Yeah, obviously our narrative is far more nuanced than that. You still have sex and experiment. You're not just going to be a kissless virgin until 40. There's also no reason you can't talk about your relationship with your parents once you get into one on our side. In fact, they probably still want you to talk about it with
So
them
you
before their
hide
parents.
these things from your parents. This is the third subpoint. This is on a spectrum of cases. If the relationship, for example, is abusive, you probably want to tell them and prove them right, that they were right for telling you that being single is so scary, and that you fucked up by going behind their back and making a decision they didn't want you to make. 2, in the lighter case, you just feel less comfortable emotionally talking about these things with your parents, so you don't want to disappoint them. They shamed you going into this. And the reason is, their narrative is actually really complex, and he was nodding when I said their narrative is going to be harsher than he actually outlined it. So clearly it's going to be harsher than the way they actually outlined it. The reason is, that means that you don't feel comfortable going in and exploring in the way that they talk about it, because you feel shame around the various things that are related to relationships, about exploring it in that way. But even so, this narrative probably pushes you for a substantial amount of independence, which means, emotionally speaking, because it is better to be single, it's better to be on your own. You probably don't feel comfortable turning to people in general because it imposes a sort of norm of independence that means that you don't want to share your emotions with others. But 4, as a parent, you are deprived from being able to discuss the joys of your own relationship. And that breaks down a significant aspect of the parent-child relationship because you feel there isn't a consistent love as a child which surrounds you. And weighing this is really important. As a parent, you probably get tired of this. You get frustrated from not being able to talk about the things like the importance of your relationship and how that love led to your child. Or you lose out on a significant portion because your child feels less emotionally connected to you or less willing to emotionally avail themselves to you. When you get better relationships on our side, this is more healthy relationships because you have the experience of multiple relationships beforehand. Maybe every relationship isn't important, but once you get at 13, don't define you for life. You get more access, more availability, more understanding, and that makes these relationships better. Yes.
Everybody ready? Everybody ready? 3, wait, do you have water in it? 3, 2, 1. It's time we stop telling our children to find their other half. They are not a half, they are a whole and should spend time investing in that whole. The framing for this round is simple. Relationships are valuable and will be an important part of life, but the way we approach them and engage with them changes their quality substantially. We say, don't fill someone else's cup, fill up your own first, and let someone else fall in love with the overflow. But that has to happen when you only focus on yourself first. Now, I want to be very clear on the first part of my engagement with OO, on the mutual exclusivity of learning mechanisms. One note, there are lots of ways to learn how to be in a good relationship and what a good relationship means for all of the reasons Matt tells you. Yes, there are overarching mechanisms like rom-coms and stuff, but there are also nuanced things that exist. For example, articles, observing loved ones and friends, debates online about it, conversations with friends, fucking guidance counselors, right, that you can talk to. In other words, there's a plethora of ways that exist outside of parents that can guide you into that relationship. But secondarily, note that these are a variety of choices that provide different perspectives that can align with your experiences. But thirdly, and this engages directly with them, if parents are progressive like they say, they will accommodate their children's failure and say, we're open to talk to you if you don't listen to us. If they love their kid, they will tell their kid to be open to them. Ask questions, allow disagreements, but yes, try to push back on them, but never say, I will never love you or I will never accept that you defied my orders. Like, these aren't helicopter parents, and we have the fiat to say we won't be that. Now then they say, but kids will want to hide it, right? You don't admit to your parents that they were right or you didn't listen to them. This then nukes all of their fucking impacts. If that's the case, you want to hide when you enter a shitty relationship because you didn't listen to your parents' advice either on their side. Because, you know, dad was right that you shouldn't trust the high school football player that was like, you know, actually after you for your body, not because you made like good songs and you like the same interests as him. So it's probably likely that there's not any mutual exclusivity on that ground. What is the comparative? There is no way to learn what you want as an individual and what your preferences are except through your own individualistic exploration where there's an emphasis on learning what you want. And this is where I'm going to be incredibly direct. You're better able to engage in relationships in the future, the clear clash in this debate, when you understand your own individual preferences better. And I want to break this down into 3 very particular categories. Firstly, you need time spent being single. Time where you think about and experiment on what your preferences are. Secondarily, less trade-offs with other people that sacrifice your own preferences so you can never develop them. Thirdly, the mindset of being single. You can be in another relationship and your parents tell you, think about yourself, but you're in love, right? You're thinking about butterflies and flowers and this is the person you might marry, you're going to fall in love. You're not in the mindset of what are my preferences. I want to make my preferences his because I want to be his and I want him to love me. Why does this mean you're better able to engage in future relationships? 1, you know what trade-offs and boundaries are the most important for you. Those can never be taught to you because you must decide and learn and experiment them yourself. Secondarily, you know what you want out of a relationship and where you want that relationship to otherwise go based on your other preferences. So it's not just what do I want as an individual, what are my career goals, where do I want to go to college, what sacrifices do I want to make, that I want to make sure somebody else doesn't take that away from me. Because note the complexity of relationships. You love someone else, but you must love yourself and you must align those interests together, but that optimal alignment cannot happen if you do not fill in the other half of that equation. How does this engage with the comparative of teaching them to be better relationships on up? But I'll take back up Dan and Kawhi first. Yeah, quick.
How do you raise your child to prefer being single, given just showing happy instances of single people is definitely not enough?
We tell them, well, we selectively teach or we selectively provide the best case scenarios of when it's single. We tell them all of the advantages of being single, all of the trade-offs that otherwise are made by society, and overinflating the trade-offs that are otherwise made when you're in a relationship. See, all of Matt's mechanisms. We give them an overarching mechanism and incentive that they don't get otherwise from society to create a balance. Now, how does this engage with the comparative of teaching them to be in relationships properly or not? The only way to truly know your interests is to make active trade-offs and exist as an individual. And secondly, the only way to have a check-back mechanism against whether you should enter a relationship or not only exists on our side. But thirdly, why does their comparative not work? Firstly, note when you're a kid, you're susceptible to shitty relationships and gullible. Even if your parents tell you what the proper relationships are, they don't exist at every point in time where you don't know, for example, maybe he's different than what my parents did. Maybe he's, maybe my parents don't know because they don't love him the same way I do. Right? You're a kid, you're fucking malleable. But secondarily, you can't get the same, they say you can't get the same fulfillment from relationships because you haven't practiced it long enough. You know what I mean? It's like, you gotta have your first heartbreaks to, understand the later ones better, and so it doesn't hurt as much. It's better your first relationship, even if it's not in high school, is in college or afterwards, where you're in a more grounded situation, where you're less emotionally volatile because you've developed as a human being, and also developed your interests, but the costs of failure aren't as great. You'll break up, you'll cry, but you can skip your next lecture, like lectures don't actually count towards your grades. But you can skip your next class or exam because that fucks up your GPA to get into college. So that the costs of failure are substantially higher on their side, even if we enter those relationships later, and it's fine if you develop what a proper relationship as at 40 instead of 30, but you're properly prepared for life in a better situation at 40 than 30 where you can maximize the rest of your preferences. But secondarily, why is being in a relationship just better? You sacrifice other important relationships on their side, in particular friendships. Why are those friendships more important as a weighing mechanism? 1, friendships comparatively are less selfish insofar as they want to they engage with you not to get something out of you like love, but just because they find you funny and they want to spend time with you. Secondarily, there's more of them. Thirdly, they teach you a variety of preferences. And fourthly, they just last longer. OG.
Relationships also require you to do things like make sacrifices. If you feel like your optimal state is one of being single, how do you actually buy into relationships in your world fully to get all these benefits?
Because in the future, you know when it's time to make sacrifices, but what sacrifices are right, and what are the kind of sacrifices that are fair to you and your preferences. We're fine if you make less sacrifices and you enter less relationships. But when you do, they are the right kinds, they are fair to you, and they optimize your preferences. Those are the kinds of sacrifices that matter. But secondarily, even if you find none of that, why is being single better? Because there's less sacrifices and trade-off at a young age that compound over time. That is to say, your career, your college, your long-term, that even if you are an individual that will not value relationships because you don't have epistemic access to their preferences, you know you're going to exist in a capitalist society where you have to get a job, you have to have money to spend on shit. So if you weigh the worst case scenarios on both sides, theirs has a far lower floor than ours. But even if you don't buy any of that, quick extension on the parent-child relationship. You probably care about your relationship with the child. Why do you have a substantially better parent-child relationship on our side with your kid? There's far less of a time trade-off. When they're in a relationship, they overextend and spend most of their time with their young love. The comparative is they might be busy on our side, but those relationships seem less important to the child in terms of the relationship to the parent. So if you care about spending time with your kid outside of any of this, you probably spend more time with them when they're not busy riding Jake's motorcycle on the way to the college football game. Never been prouder to propose.
Alright, next speaker call me Bella. Let's hear.
Bro.
I think OG is only willing to debate in the absolute best case scenario for their side, where they tell you that parents not only know what's best for the child, but also is able to communicate that in a patient, loving way. Let me tell you about the basic reality of parenting. It's difficult, it's not rewarding. Sometimes your children blame you even though that's the only thing that you want, even though all you want for them is the best. The reason this matters then is it's really, really dangerous to try and inculcate any particular preference in that child, because your own exhaustion, your impatience means that you inevitably end up telling them not just that it's preferable to be single, but that it's worse to be in a relationship, and indeed that people in relationships are worse and have made mistakes or are stupid for doing so. They're shaking their head right now because they're thinking, but isn't this symmetric to what we want to tell you? No, because Isaac's made you very, very clear from the get-go that our priority is to be supportive of the child unconditionally, to tell you that there's a variety of different ways people can be happy in different relationship structures. Obviously not said that way. Obviously you point at a single person who's happy, you point at a poly person who's happy, you point at people in relationships who are happy, and you tell them that we just want you to be happy, we want you to do whatever you want, and we want you to listen to how you feel. And this is the context in which no matter how tired and cranky you are, you don't say, shut the fuck up, I don't want to listen to you. You just tell them you should just think about yourself as opposed to getting frustrated at that child. So for those reasons, I think that they do really have to defend the worst case scenario in which parents do end up snapping, just because children are irritating, right? They keep asking you why? And if you've come back from a 12-hour work day, you don't have the patience to sit there now and explain and remind them that you love them, and all they're telling you and what you're telling them is for their own good. So for those reasons, you do end up with children who are not just scared of being in relationships, but scared of telling you about this as well, and therefore you end up with all the benefit, with all the harms, not just of losing your relationship with your child, but also being unable to guide their child down the relationship further on down the line and prevent them from making mistakes when it's actually happening on the ground. Okay, two clashes. The first is on why, actually I'll take the POI now.
If a parent is bad at communicating nuance with a child in snaps, that is not mutually exclusive. The difference is a blanket narrative that says it's better to be single is easier to understand than a complicated narrative you have to convey on your side that raises far more questions and creates more of the problems you're attempting to stymie.
I believe I did respond to this to some extent already, but I'll go into this in more detail later. So the first clash is then what is the best way to make sure that the children can describe what makes them happy and enjoy what's best for themselves? Because again, some kids want to be single, some kids want to be in relationships, we want people to be able to choose. So first let's compare the two narratives here, right? Because their approach is to say, relationships are generally bad, it's preferable to be single. We tell you there are lots of different ways to be happy, you should do whatever you want. Why is ours better for 3 reasons? The first is, it's not nuanced or complex. It's quite easy to understand that there are different kinds of relationships in the same way that they say there are single people, there are relationships. It's also quite easy to understand that you can be happy in any one of them. To be clear, it's also much easier to understand them on their side, because on their side, your parents' assertion that being single is really good and being in a relationship is sometimes bad flies in the face of what you see on a day-to-day basis, of people bitching about not having a girlfriend online, for example, or simply of seeing happy couples walking in the park all the fucking time. Because if it were true that relationships too often lead you to be unhappy, which it has to be more than an aberration, it has in some cases your parents would tell you these things, then your parents are either wrong or lying to you, so you ask them, how do you justify the real world to me, for example? The second thing is, they have a really weird and debate-led conception of how narratives work, in that they think that you have a counterbalancing narrative, and narratives exist on a sliding scale, and if you insert more singledom, then your child shifts to the right. Like, this is not true. What is instead more often true is people operate by having an understanding of the world that can swap in and out. So for example, if my parent tells me that being single is quite good, and I see lots of things that contradict the things they've said to me, then I think that an alternative reality that is mutually exclusive with what my parents are saying is true instead. That's really, really dangerous because at the point at which a child thinks the parent is lying to them, they not only throw out the idea that being single is good, but they throw a whole baby with the bathwater as well, and they fail to think about the need to be careful in relationships as well. It's much, much better then to go on our side where we don't have any facts that contradict with other narratives that they might see on a day-to-day basis. The final thing, though, is their entire case falls completely flat at the point at which you exit a society that inundates you with the idea that relationships are good. Matt is very noble and tells me that he cares about the liberation of women, but as the only person who has actually raised as a girl in this room, I assure you, I was shamed all the time for wanting to get in a relationship. I was told that boys were just out here to do things with me because my parents couldn't say the words to me, and it's really just bad and dishonorable to enter these kinds of relationships. This isn't an aberration, panel. This is the majority of the world, not just in developing conservative countries, but in America as well, because of the lingering harms of Christianity and conservatism. So for those reasons, you have this double-edged blade, right? Where this conception of not just that women like really show their good sometimes, but that women have to really, really like guard their purity for some such reason. So for those reasons, I really do think they, in these cases, align themselves with the really, really difficult poisonous narratives and hurt their children instead. I'll take the POI.
Both you and OG are engaged in a world of binaries where you either accept everything the parent says or nothing they say. Comment on what you're actually likely to believe from what your parent tells you and how you're going to weight that information.
I mean, I think it's pretty easy to wholeheartedly believe that your parent wants the best for you and that there are different ways you can be happy. You can't discard individual ways to be happy and say that doesn't align with my experience and that doesn't contradict with what your parent tells you because it's built into that model already. The second then is comparing the actions here, right? Because they think that you have to think carefully about this. The issue is they themselves say that you want to enter relationships, but that means that you don't voluntarily enter a relationship you think is bad, so you discard the notion that it's good to just enter relationships carefully. It's much better on our side because we set a bar that relationships are good, but it's only because they're beautiful, that they're really, really amazing, which then means that you measure your experiences up against that high bar and are actually more likely to be selective about the relationships you have. But second of all, let's compare it to their claim about internet resources, right? And why personal experience of having been in a relationship is actually better. Ahmed tells you that, well, we actually did decisions better on their side because singledom is necessary to understand your preferences. Well, one question I have is how do you know when your preferences kick in, right? Is there some kind of alarm that tells you, this is the right person now? No, you have to be in relationships as well. But second of all, I imagine the majority of people in this room weren't told to be single, and yet they were able to make choices. And the reason for this is children spend the majority of their time being single, and the important thing then is that you also understand those preferences on either side. Their criticism is of misogyny. The claim that you are not whole until your relationship, that your friends are less important than everything else. These are already becoming out of fashion because of the advent of even like Disney movies, like Elsa's movie, I don't know, but basically like there's a positive trend that means that their issues are no longer relevant. Happy to oppose.
Good. So as I alluded to in the POI, our extension is very simple. We're going to explain what the conversation looks like. Note, in the top half, there is a huge gap in analysis in terms of what the child is actually likely to internalize from these conversations. There needs to be a discussion about what the child would accept, how they weight that relative to other information they're given from media, from their friends, from other people they're in relationships with, and why the specific takeaways that they get from these conversations from both OG and then from the counterfactual raised by OO are likely to be relatively better or worse. We are going to fill that gap. OG ran the very stock warrant of other narratives exist, and so this is a counterweight to things that are generally bad, but I think that XK was correct to point out that they basically just used a sliding scale and said that you'll move from the far right to like the center right, and that is something that is good. The first thing I want to discuss here is both teams seem to agree that a good relationship is a good thing in the long term. Nobody took the radical stance of we should just not have monogamy in this debate, at least not for most people. What I'm first going to raise is how do we get to a conception of what a good relationship relationship is that something that you're likely to accomplish fully through a discussion with your parent, engaging directly with the alternative raised by OO? We think not, for a couple of major reasons, because discussions with parents are very difficult to accomplish on this question. Firstly, because parents typically grow up in a very different context, in different cultural contexts, in a time in which the role of women, for example, is very, very different, in a time in which the average age of getting married is usually a few years earlier. And that means that they are likely to say things in a conversation about what makes a good relationship that are almost always going to be bad or misleading or not comport with your intuitions, because you just look up in the real world and nobody you know is doing anything that your parent knows about. So the conversations they're trying to have are very unlikely to be credible. Secondly, discussing things like sex can be incredibly difficult between a child and a parent. The easy way to make this argument is to gut check the average intelligent voter panel. How many of you enjoy having conversations about sex with your parents? Most of you probably don't, or probably don't have those conversations altogether, because it's an incredibly awkward thing to do when you grow up in the same house and were a little child in that environment for 18 plus years. And so it's very unlikely you will do this well. Thirdly, you observe friends and the media who are having experiences that don't fit into your parenting stories, things like the internet of radically changed dating culture, and your parents are never going to understand this. And fourth and finally, if in a world in which your parents are just telling you, this is how you have a good relationship, but we do support relationships unconditionally, you will eventually get into some relationships. And I think once you get into a relationship, you become incredibly irrational to outside information, right? Just think about how many people get into a relationship and then get sucked into every single word of what their partner tells them. They are very easily gaslit or manipulated, which makes it incredibly hard for them to get this nuance done. So, how do you actually accomplish learning what a good relationship is? We think it's a completely different thing. It's primarily lived experience. Having lots of different shorter-term relationships is something good. Having shorter relationships that are often not open can be something that is good. Having conversations with your peers in the same kind of experiences is also helpful perspective. And finally, learning how to exist on your own as a single person is pretty good, right? Because you get better information about what you want, what you care about, and therefore you have a better idea of what kind of gap you want somebody else to fill in your life. To be clear, a relationship is not just having sex with someone or feeling close to someone. A relationship is a very specific concept. It is a contract that you make with someone that says that you will bind your time to that individual, that you will put yourself on a path that directionally makes you more likely to live with that individual and have children with that individual on average. That is very different from having closeness or intimacy, which is like all four of the warrants they cited for why relationships are good, are just reasons of closeness and intimacy. I guarantee you, every single one of those warrants, I was thinking about my best friend and not thinking about the person that I'm in a relationship with. And then they tacked on one when I POI'd them, which is you can have sex with them as well. A, lots of people have sex with friends, and we can just encourage that more on our side, or your friends will maybe encourage you to do that. And B, lots of people also have sex in relationships later on, or in shorter term relationships, but they get their closeness and intimacy and depth from their friendships. That is not something that is exclusive on our side. So XK's point as well, that like parents are going to tell you don't have sex and be incredibly sexist. Yes, there are some parents that regrettably feel this way, but those parents are saying this on either side of the house because their problem is not with relationships in the way that I've defined it. Their problem is with sex, period. And so those parents are far above the threshold of this debate, right? We are talking about the narrow concept of do you hook yourself to someone up? So, when your parent says do not enter a relationship as we have defined it, what are they likely to focus on and what will you likely internalize? I think parents have unique credibility in two key respects. The first respect is on matters of financial discipline. You are more likely to care about what your parent says when it comes to finances because they're the only adult who actually opens up their finances to you, who you have seen do the work of providing for a family, who you have seen the struggles over your entire lifetime of making bills work, of getting to work every single day while also dropping the kids off to school. And so you know that in order to get a similar quality of life to what you had when you were a child, you probably do want to be listening to their advice. So when parents have this conversation, kids will often listen to advice about how they should wait longer in their career, for example, to get to a promotion or to get to a position of financial security so that when they do enter into a relationship, for example, they will have more leverage in that relationship. They'll have more of a choice over where they choose to live. That they shouldn't, for example, at the age of 23, right out of college, go and follow their boyfriend across the country to take the job in Los Angeles instead of taking a better job in New York City. These kinds of things parents do have lots of credibility around, and we think that it's good for kids to internalize this for a couple of reasons. A, is that finding yourself, keeping up with your friendships, just having a good life does take a lot of time and money, and so having those resources is often helpful. Quickly, I'll take opening.
Giving your child advice once they're an adult isn't inculcating a preference to be single. You must start that when they're a little child, and that involves telling them relationships are bad.
So yes, you will start it as a little child and tell them that they should be single. You don't have to say relationships are bad, you have to say being single is good, that prioritizing your career, that having dreams and goals and aspirations is good, and getting into a relationship can trade off with that. And the second reason why money is good is that you have leverage in your relationship, as I've already explained, which means that when you do get into a relationship, you have more choice, you're less likely to end up in abusive situations, etc. I think the second area where parents have credibility is on issues of having children. So for example, mothers communicating with their daughters about what the process of having a child is like, the trade-offs that are involved with it, how your body fundamentally changes, how the things you can do fundamentally change, the way people view you fundamentally changes. That's probably the only person who has that kind of perspective that will open up to a daughter. And I think having those conversations can also be helpful for people delaying the choice to have a child, and therefore having more of an opportunity to find themselves, to maintain their other intimate relationships, and also to have that kind of security. We think that as people learn more about their trade-offs, they are more likely to find ways to navigate them. So that is, on average, we would expect that this will lead to people delaying committed long-term relationships, things that approximate marriage. But even if they don't, they now clearly understand the trade-offs involved and what the threshold would be for them to get over that trade-off. So that is, okay, I know that if I've saved up X amount of money, then I know that I have what I need to have the life that I want, and I can move on to moving in with someone or pursuing having a child. That is something that means that when you do get to a relationship, it'll be of a higher quality. But note that the way in which the relationship is high quality is also determined by lots of other people, lots of other factors. We bridge that gap on our side. We are exceptionally proud to propose.
I think the speaker and phone number of all of you.
The issue with closing government is that while they're correct that pointing out characteristics of parents makes them bad at talking about relationships, it's equally comparatively true that those same characteristics of parents makes them bad at telling their child to be single. It's the exact conservatism that they talk about, that when they grew up during an age of where hooking up, for example, is stigmatized, that when they tell their child to be single, they probably also don't endorse the idea of hooking up with other people, exploring your sexuality, and other things. So their case is incredibly uncomparative, because if they have these bad characteristics and they're so conservative, they'll also be conservative in the way they teach their child to be single. So for those reasons, they need to explain why in their world the conversation is likely to be a lot better, instead of just talk about why the conversation in our world is going to be very worse. So in the instance in which they don't prove that comparative, it's unclear to me what the delta of closing government is. But secondly, respond to this idea of financial stability. The credibility of telling your child to pursue a career or pursue financial stability is not exclusive to telling your child to be single. If they are so persuasive that, for example, this is the only adult that you've ever seen make money, then obviously you're still going to buy them and just agree to the idea that it's more important to do well in school, get your college degree, find a job, and then settle down, which is something that we can equally say in opposition's world and not unique to the world of closing government where you have to tell your child to be single. So this idea of pursuing your career is not unique to telling your child to be single, but it's something that we can very happily endorse as a parent in our world. So for that reason, I just don't think closing government are a very comparative team in this debate. The first question I want to ask is, how do you raise your child to prefer being single? Opening governments say that all you do is show happy single people and the advantages of being single. But that's insufficient insofar as you can symmetrically see happy cuffed people. You can see the advantages of being in a relationship in wider media. So the opening government line under this argument is probably very weak. Opening opposition say that if the countervailing narratives are so high, then obviously you have to be much more harsher in the way you tell your child to be single. What we're going to say is the argument from closing opposition is very simple. The way you impose this preference on your child is by making your child inherently distrustful of other people. I want to be very clear about what the opening opposition line under this argument is. They say that you are more harsh and as a result impose a sense of independence. All I'm going to do is mechanize this claim and reach the actual logical conclusion of what this means. How are parents going to tell their child to be single? Firstly, they're probably going to prevent ways in which their child could enter a relationship as when they grow up. It looks like doing things like stopping making friends with the opposite sex. It looks like not letting them out after school and hang out with their friends. It looks like constant monitoring of their phones and mobile devices to ensure that they're not entering into relationships. Importantly, because you're scared of your child entering into a relationship, you prevent all of the ways that they could be in a relationship, which involves shutting down a lot of facets and aspects of their life that they would have growing up. But secondly, it looks like constant negative reinforcement about relationships, about people who are in relationships. If you're a single mother raising a daughter, it looks like saying things like all men are trash, and that you shouldn't trust other men, and that you shouldn't ever enter a relationship because all they're going to do is cheat on you, lie on you, manipulate you, etc. It's incredibly unlikely that you're going to be doing these things. But thirdly, it looks like telling your child about all of your negative experiences when you had relationships in the past. It looks like talking about how you've been cheated on, about how you've been manipulated, about what all the experiences that happened to you that made you lose out on a relationship, that made you mistrustful of other people. What are the outcomes of all these ways in which you tell your child to be single? The first is that, for example, if you get caught as a child in a relationship, then the outcome and fallout from your parents is going to be especially bad. It looks like, for example, them taking away your phone, not letting you go to, like, for example, after-school activities. It just looks like a huge fallout with your parents, especially in, like, if your parents aren't white. Then obviously the fallout with your parents is going to be super harsh and something that opening opposition don't ever grapple with. But the more important conclusion of this argument is that the way in which you wire your child's brain to interact with other people is basically to tell them, do not trust anyone, be inherently mistrustful of everyone you meet. And this is how we beat both government teams. What we tell people, and how they're winning, is that you can at least develop connections with friends and intimate connections in this way. But the issue is, when this inherent mistrust that you build into your child spills over to every single person that you meet, that's when they lose their capacity to make friends. That's when they lose their capacity to just develop deep connections with people, even in a non-romantic setting, because it means because the distrust that you root in their mind is going to fester and go into every other relationship. But more importantly, it probably makes your child more mistrustful of you as a parent as well, because you're talking about all of the negative things that happen to you, all the negative things that you might not necessarily know about a person until they randomly drop that bombshell on you. So when your child starts to mistrust you, that's incredibly problematic for all of the reasons that you have later down when you need your child to support you in your later life. I'll take opening.
So we have fiat because this is a poly solution, so we will not do crazy shit. But the problem is, your openings narrative also teaches children to mistrust certain types of people because opening opposition prompt discouraging some relationships. I am incredibly amused you think there's a delta here, but not in our case.
Okay, so the issue with just modeling that you're going to show all the advantages of being in a relationship means that you probably almost certainly fail in telling people that they're going to be single. And as a result, if you're just going to be failing, then you also have no delta, right? If you want to be successful at telling people to prefer being single, then you probably have to do the things that both opening and closing tell you. The second thing I want to do in this speech is I just want to point out all the things that you miss out on as a parent if you are successful and your child is successful. Importantly, this is a higher order argument than opening opposition, because they say all the things that a child misses out on if they're not in a relationship. I'm going to talk about all the things a parent misses out on if their child isn't in a relationship. Given that we're talking about the parent, it's more important what matters to the parent. What happens to you if your child is single? First, you probably have family fallout from, for example, your parents, the child's grandparents, your aunts and uncles, who are all telling you, like, why isn't your child getting into a relationship? Why don't I have nieces and nephews? Why don't I have grandkids, etc.? So you have the huge family fallout. Secondly, you don't have the financial stability of this child when they don't have a spouse, for example, in the future. You don't have, for example, grandkids yourself as a parent because your child never entered into a relationship. What you miss out on is, for example, if you're a father, you don't get to walk your daughter down the aisle, which when you're growing up, when you're 40, 50 years old, and you only have one daughter, that's probably one of the most meaningful aspects and moments of your life. Just this ability to go to your child's wedding. Another thing that you miss out on. You miss out on the dependence when you're old, because when your child is inherently mistrustful of other people, they probably don't come back to you for as much support, and as much love, and as much sympathy. So for these reasons, as a parent, you're more likely to miss out on all of these things. For those reasons, incredibly proud to oppose.
Alright, and the speaker in column go what?
Devesh won this debate when he was the only person in this room to describe what a relationship actually was. So I'm going to address this debate from two perspectives. Firstly, the question of what a relationship actually is, and secondly, what we think the conversation with your children is likely going to play out as. Firstly then, what do we think a relationship is? Because I think the mischaracterization from opposition bench in this debate, and some implicit exception of this mischaracterization from opening government, is the fact that they seem to conceptualize a relationship as something that is purely just a emotional bond with another individual, a perhaps sexual bond with another individual. But what they fail to address is the fact that a concept of a relationship is rooted in marriage. It is an idea that you have special obligations of trust and connection and dependency on an individual that is completely outside and specifically differentiated from any normal relationship you could have with a friend or with a family member. The reason why this is then so important is because all of the impacts that opposition bench actually wants you to obtain from having good and healthy relationships are probably one in an ideal world that you as a parent want your child to have with their friends, with people that won't have relationships that are obfuscated with boundaries, obfuscated with burdens and conceptions of what should or shouldn't happen, given the media's perception, given their socially pressured perception of what relationships should look like. The reason why this is then so important is twofold. Firstly, because all of OO's argumentation is thus flipped. Because friends should be the ones who are taking up the roles of teaching you what it is like to trust someone, teaching you what it is like to have an emotional connection, teaching you what it is like to be able to talk about things when you're upset, talking about things when you're happy, and sharing things in your life. But relationships are something that are uniquely more dangerous, especially when you're at a younger age. To the extent to which Isaac tells us, you should be willing and able to learn what you love and to be judgment-free. If we really just gut check this, when you're a kid in middle school and high school and college, these are the maximal judgment areas, right? These are the times where you feel most socially pressured, where you refuse to admit your identity, you refuse to admit who you love because you're so afraid of judgment. I would say that the actual time where you're able to learn what you love in a judgment-free zone tends to be adulthood, when not only do you actually know what you like because you've actually had the time to develop your own individual interests, but you also tend to be in a sphere in which other people have also developed their own interests, and thus you can actually find people who have symmetric interests, but you're also in an environment in which people have normalized and accepted the idea that you can be yourself. The second thing I want to talk about then is what we think this conversation actually looks like, because I think Devesh gave you a lot of really good material that goes pretty much completely dropped from closing opposition, right? I think the first thing that he tells you is the actual difficulty of having a conversation about relationships, because I don't think anyone actually gives a good characterization of what this conversation is supposed to look like. Unlike what I think is the presumed discussion coming from opening half, this discussion is not going to be one where you just implicitly drop huge bombs about how why relationships are horrible and every single one of them needs to be mistrustful. In fact, on government side, you can even tell them that relationships are great and that they are something that you should strive for in the future. The way you actually convince children to stay single is by giving them priorities above that. That is to say, you educate them from the start that school is a trade-off with their relationship, that you shouldn't prioritize until you've sufficiently educated yourself, that financial stability is a priority that comes above relationships, that you should first focus on making sure that you can be financially independent so you don't end up in a bad relationship, you end up in a good one, like me and your mom's relationship, right? That's the way you educate someone, that you should prioritize other things, that you should choose to be single, even if your end goal eventually becomes a relationship. The reason why this is then so important is twofold, right? Firstly, just because this is the structural link that buys into all of opening government's arguments. But secondly, also it prevents unique harms that Devesh brings out to you that are unresponded to whatsoever. That is to say, it prevents the worst of the worst case scenarios. That is probably when it comes to relationships, especially early relationships, the biggest harm is something like accidental teen pregnancy, which is something that is severely much less likely going to happen when you have the awareness and the priorities to understand why it is that firstly, you probably won't be engaging in a relationship at that time, but secondly, when you do so, you're much more risk averse because of the ways that you address relationships, right? And so on net, we remove the worst of harms, and we also recognize all of the benefits and the good scenarios. The last argument I think that addresses this coming from opposition side is that they tell us, but in the worst case scenarios, when you do decide to date behind the backs of your parents, it becomes so much more difficult to engage with them. The reason why this is not true is twofold. The first thing that I want to point out is all of their analysis about not having abusive or controlling relationships with your parents are probably symmetric, right? Controlling parents, especially the ones who have a bad mindset opposite towards parenting who only want to vicariously experience their own imagination through their child tend to already be abusive in many, many other areas. For example, they might just be stalking your phone because they care too much about your safety or don't want you to hang out with the wrong friends. And so to the extent to which they're obsessively controlling, they're probably going to be so on either side of the house. But the second and more important thing to note here is that our message is actually reconcilable with you having a relationship. And the reason why this is important is because you can tell your parents, yes, I understood the messages that you taught me. Finances and education are important, but because I'm smart, I can take advantage of this and I can balance that with a relationship. Whereas your advice about what a good and perfect relationship is irreconcilable with the idea of them going on and dating someone that maybe doesn't match the image of a perfect potential partner into the future. I'll take it over.
Our claim was not about abusive parents. It was that in the majority of cases where circumstances are outside of your control, you end up spreading this narrative in a way that hurts your child and makes it difficult for them to enter relationships.
Yes. I understand that you say that there can be communication issues. What I'm telling you is that these messages are probably not only easier to develop because you don't actually have to talk about relationships at all. You just have to over-prioritize the experiences that are associated with education and finances, but you also can reconcile them much better because eventually when they enter the relationship, it becomes easier for you to start then a conversation about relationships that is reconcilable with your previous messages about what are more important than relationships. The last thing then is closing opposition gives us an even more grim depiction of what a basically surveillance state parent would then look like. I would just say that in these circumstances, these parents are probably going to impose on you in many other ways in many other fields, and I would say that on net in general, I think for the purposes of this debate, we have to kind of assume that this parenting is going to be somewhat reasonable, and in every instance in which it's going to be bad, it's probably going to be worse on your side for the very same reasons why Devesh told you. It is inherently more difficult to talk about discussions of sex and discussions of relationships with your parents. These are inherently uncomfortable topics, especially given the fact that most parents try to isolate relationships and sex from their children, even though that they are in a relationship, which tends to be a topic that they avoid to have and then thus have to have later on, which makes it structurally more difficult. All this said, what basically we think closing government brings to you in this debate is the actual mechanization as to why relationships are likely going to be better, but even in the cases where they don't happen, you prioritize things that matter much more. I'm very proud to propose.
I'll start with CG. Their first claim is that your capacity to discuss specifically relationships is weakened relative being single. Several responses. One, as OO explicitly sets up, it's likely that norms are developing over time, meaning that they can reasonably counterprop that you would have these direct discussions about what these relationships are going to look like. But secondly, surely, if they want the good impacts of being single to kick in, i.e., you gain financial independence, and then later on in a relationship that you do eventually have leverage in that relationship, they must concede that you need to talk about relationships in the first place. I.e., the unproven premise of their argument is that inasmuch as you become single and gain financial independence, you will have that leverage in the relationship. But the whole point of our case was that inasmuch as you don't have those conversations in the first place, you don't use that leverage in the first place. Whereas, under our side of the house, inasmuch as you as a parent have a direct conversation with your child about what exactly that relationship would look like, it's more likely that you use that leverage to counteract the fact that someone else is taking advantage of you, which directly flips their claim. Versus on their side of the house, when you just say, just be single, you don't have that conversation to to moderate the extent to which someone else could take advantage of you in the very first place. But thirdly, and this is very important, parents asymmetrically are better positioned to talk about being in relationships than talking about being single. One, because they have incentives to specifically research what a good relationship would look like. So even if there is some degree of a generational gap, you have conversations with other people, parents who, by the way, are disproportionately teaching children that they should be single in the very first place. But more importantly, other people within your family are also emphasizing that it's important to be in a relationship. And the reason that you know this is true is because of OG's own argument. I.e., OG explicitly concedes that there are very strong countervailing narratives which say that you should be in a relationship. What that then means is that the access to information that you have as a parent about being in a relationship is much, much larger than the access you as a parent have to being single and how to lead a good life while being single. So what that then means is that you can have conversations with other parents and sort of crowdsource those conversations and sort of wordings that you're going to use with your child about what a good relationship actually looks like. So what this then means is that you are asymmetrically better positioned to give good advice about what it means to be in a relationship versus being single, which flips their argument. So even if a generational gap exists on either side of the debate, inasmuch as you are better equipped to give advice about what being in a relationship looks like, we are better able to resolve that generational gap, which breaks the deadlock. Secondly, CG claims that you can focus more on your finances and then that's going to be good. One, you're probably not discussing finances in particular, and lots of the other claims that they talk about, i.e. having children, when your child is so particularly young, so unclear why their extension is particularly unique. But secondly, as I point out earlier, the conclusion of their argument just doesn't follow because they don't prove the internal burden of their argument, i.e. that you will use that leverage in your relationship in a good way. So their case does not work. Let's do some targeted weighing about why my responses are sufficient to be their case, while their case is not sufficient to be us. One, we are able to co-opt their case. Because if I am able to prove that you are asymmetrically better able to teach your child to engage in a relationship in a good way versus being single, then we get all of their impacts of having children in ways that are more planned out, or using your finances better. But number two, we heavily mitigate their impacts in as much as the exclusivity of their case is highly questionable. But thirdly, as Rohan points out, in as much as you damage your relationship with your parents, then we are prior to their arguments, because their arguments are contingent on you give your child this advice. But if you don't listen to your parent in the first place, then the downstream impacts that they give you of using finances in good ways or having conversations about planning when you're going to have children just do not kick in. So comprehensively, CG is out of this debate. Let's deal with opening government's claims. Their first claim is that this is a necessary countervailing narrative against other narratives. As I already pointed out, we are uniquely able to leverage those countervailing narratives in order to give advice in better ways. Some additional reasons why this is going to create resentment between you and your child. The first thing I want to point out is that there's an overwhelming sense under their side of the house that you are missing out as a child. Why? Because you talk to your other friends who also are having conversations with their parents where they're saying, me and my parents had a conversation about what it looks like to be in a relationship because, as GovBench must concede, this is a dominant overwhelming norm. But number two, you go to your relatives who are also likely older, who likely also emphasize things like the importance of being in a relationship. So what that then means is that there's likely conflicting information. And notably, this is a much clearer mechanism than the mechanism we get from OO. Because the main mechanism we get from OO is just a broad sense of missing out, or that your parent eventually snaps at you. But this is a more direct mechanism. Why? Because it's not just about nebulous alternative sources of media, but it's about other people in your life, like your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, who you do deeply trust, and them giving you conflicting information. So what that then means is that that is the controlling mechanism for feeling distrust between you and your parent in the very first place. So this is a more direct mechanism than opening opposition. Before I move on, OG.
Please do not be fooled into thinking there's a gap in our analysis for this back half exchange. We proved on the top half our narrative is easier to understand and convey. You misunderstand.
I'm going to respond to that. So the other thing that I want to point out is that Rohan's argument about cognitive dissonance is also a better mechanism than opening opposition's mechanism about frustration. Why? Because it's more charitable. Because as OO themselves concede, you as a parent are likely to approach these conversations in a good way. So the mechanism we get from OO of you just snap at your child is unrealistic. Whereas our mechanism about why you yourself emphasize that being in a relationship is good, and then having cognitive dissonance about that is much more plausible, and therefore we are likely to outweigh on the link level relative opening opposition. So, inasmuch as that is true, let's deal with the next opening government claim. So, the next claim that OG also flags in a POI is that you asymmetrically cannot convey why being in a relationship is good relative to being single. They say that being in a good relationship is uniquely more complex. One, their own arguments seem to contradict this, because the premise of their case is this is a countervailing narrative. If this is true, surely being single and using this countervailing narrative is going to seem way more complex and way more otherworldly to your child. So that directly flips their mechanism. Whereas, if you use a narrative that aligns with what your child is hearing everywhere else, it's more likely that that particular narrative is going to seem less complex and otherworldly. But secondly, they say you don't know how to engage in a good relationship, but you do because you're in one. You had the child in the first place. You have lots of experience. So these mechanisms are just deeply, deeply debate land. So what does this do to top half? One, our responses to OG are more offensive than OO, because OO just assumes that your parent will have a conversation in a good way, or you snap at your child, whereas we explain why asymmetrically, the conversations you have between you and your child are just likely to be better and more informed. But number two, that downstream arguments that OG gives you just don't work if we question the premise of whether this relationship can be communicated in a good way. Very proud to oppose.